guys, it's Sam, and this is my wrap up for July. In July, I read 9 books and 1 short story, an overall pretty decent reading month. I have found, unsurprisingly, that doing this little Hugo nominee project is going very well because the books are good, right? Even if they're not for me, they're good. So first off is Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. I already have a full spoiler-free review for this book, which has more of my in-depth thoughts, but this is essentially a speculative novel that combines lighter elements of fantasy and sci-fi in this like Faustian dilemma with both of those situations, following both the woman in the Faustian dilemma who basically has to trade musician souls, like 7 of them, so that she doesn't have to go to hell, and then her potential newest student who is a trans girl that is like on the run from her family, like homeless, and is this like sort of violin progeny, and then there's like other little POVs mixed in there as well. This does have a number of trigger warnings for transphobia, racism, self-harm, and sexual violence, so there are some pretty heavy themes here. I went into this expecting a little bit more. I didn't really know what I expected because I didn't necessarily go in knowing a ton of what it was about. I just knew it was a nominee, people have been talking about it, the cover's beautiful, and people really talk about it as being the Wayfarers meets Good Omens, which I kind of do agree with that vibe. However, I think this would do so much better in a TV show, personally. Like, I can definitely see that. I didn't really feel like we got deep enough with a lot of the characters. A lot of it was so surface level because so many themes are being tackled in this book. So much. About like fate, about gender, about love, about family, about relationships with other people, like sexism within like families and cultures. Like, there's so much stuff that's touched on, AI stuff, like so much, and there just wasn't enough time in a book this short. Ultimately, it felt more like a contemporary story to me with some of these like fantasy and sci-fi bits mixed in, instead of those feeling like fully integrated in a way that felt like realistic. But in the same way, that's why I feel like it would work as a TV show or something like the Good Omens show, because it had that like quirkiness to it that I think would really work well in a visual medium. I still enjoyed it. It was a really quick read. I just expect a little bit more out of it, so I ended up giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next was a short story, which was A Dead Djinn in Cairo by P. Djeli Clark. This takes place in the world of a Master of Djinn, which I also read this month, and people said that like they recommended reading this short story, especially first. You don't have to. I just thought, like, why not? And I'm glad I did, because it gave me like a little snippet of the writing, got me kind of excited to be in the world. I was like, wow, this world is really cool. It's following like the main character, who is our main character in A Master of Djinn, which again, I'll get to. During this one case that involves a dead Djinn, involves a angel, and is taking place in this like steampunk turn of the 19th century Cairo, that is like very much a world power, and just is a really cool world. So it gave you like a snippet, a taste of that. So I would say if you are thinking about reading this series like I started to, read one of the short stories. There's this one and another one. Read both of them if you want to, obviously, but it gives you a good indicator if you're probably gonna like the novel. I ended up giving that one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is a standalone sci-fi. It follows a character who wakes up in space, doesn't know how he got there, has this like amnesia, and is having to sort everything together about like why he's there. We also get flashbacks of kind of how he got there, and it eventually sort of converges into like, you know, sort of the beginning of the story. And it's a little bit of like, there's a potential apocalypse, and you know pretty early like he was sent to like try to figure some of this stuff out, but you don't know all the details. I listened to this on audiobook, which was a correct choice. Initially, I got it from my library in physical copy, and I was like, no, because I don't tend to love like heavy science, and there is some pretty heavy science in this. I wouldn't necessarily call this a hard sci-fi. I think that Andy Weir writes in a way that makes it very approachable. That's why The Martian was so popular. However, I would get bogged down reading this, I think, but having him say it to you, like, and the narrator, this book is so good on audio. They've already won awards for like this audiobook. So the narration is fantastic, and it allowed me to just kind of like gloss over / kind of understand better, I think, the sciencey bits that he was trying to get across, and I ended up really enjoying this. It is definitely like a popcorn, fun, entertaining, fast-paced book. I'm not sure that it's gonna necessarily stick in my brain forever. There are elements of it that will, and there are some things about it that I found like slightly unrealistic, because you eventually find out that like basically the world had to come together and like figure out a solution to this thing because the world might end. At the way that some of the things came about, I was like, knowing what we know now with pandemics and everything going on, Would the world come together in this way? I think no. So that was a little bit like, for me, it sort of jarred me out of the story a bit, but ultimately super fun. I give this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I then read She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. I have a review coming up for this one. It's already filmed, but I think it's gonna come out after this. So more of my in-depth thoughts will be there. This is the first book in a historical fantasy duology that's following the rise of one of the emperors. I think it's of the Ming Dynasty, I want to say, but it's gender swapped. So in this, the main character is a woman. She ends up sort of like impersonating her brother who dies and taking on his fate in order to like eventually become this like ruler. Like, we're following this journey. We also follow a man who is a eunuch in the like enemy, in this case the Mongolian like clans, and he was betrayed by them, and like so there's stuff going on with him as well. So there's kind of like two different POVs that we're following. They do have importance to each other, and they kind of like sort of orbit around each other a bit. There are triggers in here for war, sexism, and bullying. I would say in comparison, this is a less intense, similar thematically like Poppy War. Less fantasy elements to it. Honestly, the fantasy elements in here are very, very, very slight, sprinkled on, and could be removed. And like in this book at least, nothing would change from the story. You could just put in something like actually real there instead of using that fantasy element. So the fantasy element, very minor. And it's a little bit less grimdark than something like the Poppy War, but similar vibes as far as like the watching the military political machinations, people grasping for power. They start out in like a kind of school training situation, all of that. Like similar vibes there. Not at all the same story. It's not like if you're gonna like one, you're definitely gonna like the other, whatever. I'm not saying that they're the same story, but like some similar vibes there. I liked this, but didn't love it. I was expecting this to be a 5-star, ended up being a 4-star for me. I like the like historical like world setting and the characters. Really, it was the character interactions here that like really got me. Like these complex character dynamics and interactions, and the discussion of like, what does it mean to sort of have like this fate, and can you change that, and like who has the power, and shifting power dynamics and all of that. I was a little bit disappointed that like there wasn't actually a lot of fantasy in here. Like this really did read more like a historical fiction. It is queer though. It is queer, it is sapphic. It's not a very like graphic content sexual stuff. There is like one scene though that if you know anything about this book, that kind of like comes out of left field, but it's not like it's erotica or anything. Also, I don't particularly, like I love political machinations, but I don't really love military strategizing, and there's definitely like a lot of that in here, and that can like bog me down personally. Nothing wrong with the book. That's what this book is about in large part, but like a little bit too much for me, which is what kept it from being a 5. The lack of fantasy and like so much military like conniving stuff. But ultimately still really liked it. I'm gonna be continuing with this duology when the next book comes out. I then read All About Love by Bell Hooks. This is a book I've been reading like slowly for the last couple of months, like nonfiction and things that I tend to read kind of for work. Like it's not necessarily a workbook, but like nonfiction stuff tends to be like psychology leaning for me. And this is Bell Hooks's like sort of theory on love, discussion of love, and it's not just romantic love, sort of what she feels like we need to do as a society to shift how we feel about love, how misogyny and the patriarchy affects that. This was written in the 90s, so it is slightly dated. And I will say that for as much as she talks about men's idea of love not always necessarily being like what we need to go by because of those like patriarchal values, she does cite a lot of like male authors' work on love more than women's in here, which I thought was a little bit interesting when I was like noting that. There are some very poignant lines in here that I really liked, but overall it wasn't like something that blew me away. I was expecting a little bit more like action steps, I guess. I don't know, like I don't necessarily like, I wanted like a little bit more than just poignant comments. This is a book that leans more heavily into like there being hope for love basically, and not like just existing in this like pessimistic view on love. But I was hoping for like a little bit more of her thoughts on how those things can change on a societal level, and I don't really feel like I got that, besides her being like, we need to go into everything with love. And I'm like, yeah, how do we shift that? So I ended up giving this 3 stars. There are some lines in here that are like 4 and 5 star lines though. but like overall 3 stars. I then read Firekeepers Daughter by Angeline Booley. This I actually listened to on audiobook, which I'm really glad that I did because the audiobook narration is great and immersive. This is a book that I'd heard things here and there about, but I wanted to pick a book that had like really good indigenous rep in it, and I was in a bookstore months ago during one of my bookstore vlogs, and they tend to curate and showcase like BIPOC authors, and so they had this on a table, and I was like, I've heard good things about that. I don't really know what it's about. I'm picking it up. What it is a YA contemporary mystery that is following a main character who is a part, like, she's indigenous. She lives near the Ojibwe reservation. She is Ojibwe, and at the beginning of the story there is a murder, and she pretty much gets pulled into potentially like what's going on with this investigation, how some of her family was potentially involved with this, and like what's going on, and it ends up really circling around this like drug ring. There's also this new boy in town that she's like pretty interested in. He's like involved with like the hockey team because like hockey's a big thing here with like their culture and everything, and just like where they are regionally. So it's this like contemporary mystery story. There are a bunch of triggers in here for racism, misogyny, obviously murder, gun violence, drug abuse, and an on-page rape. It's not graphic, but it is there. And this was a book that I'm glad that I read, but like the actual plot is not something that was like super interesting to me. I don't love like a sort of like mystery drug like ring thing, like that's not really interesting to me. So like that part of the content was like fine. Like nothing was like a super big twist to me for that necessarily. There was like one piece that kind of was, but ultimately it was like the world building and just like the immersion into Ojibwe culture that was the best. If it didn't have that, this would just be like a very standard like YA mystery story. But that was really cool. And like the narrator had like the accents and everything, and it just was really well done and super interesting, and like that made the mystery that much more interesting because of all the cultural influences in it. The relationship as well wasn't my favorite. There is a power dynamic and age gap situation that's going on that just made it was too much for me to be able to pull for due to her age and his age. It's ultimately still really well written. If you like mystery stories especially, you're probably gonna really love this, especially with all that indigenous representation and like cultural influence. I ended up giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars. I then read Across the Greengrass Fields by Shauna Maguire. This is the 6th, I think, book in the Wayward Children series. This is nominated for a Hugo. And this is a potential entry point into the series because this is a sort of like standalone in this companion series, and it follows a character that we have not yet met and her journey while she goes into this world that is basically like a horse girl world. Like she goes into this like place called Hoofland, which is everyone, like all these hoofed creatures, centaurs, unicorns, kelpies, all these different things, and she escapes her world because she is outed as intersex, and so there's a lot of like bullying and things. She runs away, she finds her door, she goes in this world. So it's still following the Wayward Children formula of like following a sort of theme, you know, the character going into their world and like, you know, discovering this new world, all of that, because this is a series about kids that end up finding doors to alternate universes, you know, alternate sort of fairy tale worlds, and eventually getting kicked out of those worlds and like not knowing what to do. So I'm sure she'll be in future books with the rest of the Wayward Children kids, but it's a good starting point if you haven't read the rest of the series, apparently. I don't think I would have been super connected to it if I hadn't read the rest of the series though. So there are triggers in here for bullying, but ultimately this one is not the strongest, but it's not the weakest of the ones I've read so far. I do tend to like the ones that are following them are like main storyline characters and have like the ensemble. Those tend to be more fun. Also the Hooflands world is like cool. I was like a semi-horse girl. Like I wasn't allowed to ride horses as a kid because my dad thought they were dangerous, but I like loved horses. So like I get that, but it was fine. It was like a little bit of a found family dynamic, but I didn't feel like the theming on this one was as on point and well fleshed out as other books in this series have been. Wasn't my favorite world. She wasn't my favorite character. Like, I'm interested to see her again. She's fine, but like nothing groundbreaking here. I still like these books though, and I gave this one 3.75 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valente, another Hugo nominee. This is one that I almost forgot about when I was doing my original video. That someone had to remind me that this was nominated. I don't tend to like Catherine M. Valente's books though, so I went into this one with like fairly low leery expectations. This is a climate crisis sci-fi novella. So in this we are following a character who lives in the far future of Earth, and the world has essentially ended, like the climate apocalypse has happened, and now the remaining humans all live on the garbage patch floating around the ocean, and that is like its own little world. Like there are parts of it that are like all the electrical stuff called like Electric Town, and then there's like candle something, and like where all the candles and all the wax are and whatever. So it's like this little sort of fantastical world in a garbage heap. So we essentially just follow our main character's life. Like, she tells us about Garbage Town, about like her upbringing and all this stuff. I listened to this on audio, and the audio was both good and bad because the narrator is good, but I will say she uses a very young sounding, I think it's a Cockney accent, but it's a certain kind of accent, British accent, but it's very young sounding the entire time, and she's actually much older. Like, there are parts of it where she's young, but she's older throughout the book, and she reads as a child the whole time if you're listening to the audiobook, which I think wasn't great, because you should have been able to tell that she was an adult later on in the story. But ultimately, like, she is incredibly endearing. She's very hopeful. She is very, like, brash and unapologetic. And it's just a lot of these, like, again, character interactions, how people interact with her. There are triggers in here for bullying and child abuse. She has a rough life, but she, again, has a lot of hope throughout, and we're just like seeing how people interact with her and like hope for the future in this like just weird Catherine M. Valente world and writing style. But I was surprised. I ended up really enjoying this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm not sure if that's because I went in with such low expectations. Like, Catherine M. Valente books I don't tend to like, but I do think they are also very just hit or miss in general for people. And this I liked. Like, if you like our main character, you're gonna like this book. Next, I read A Master of Jinn by P. Djeli Clark. So this is the novel that was in the same world as A Dead Jinn in Cairo. This follows our main character of Fatma in Cairo in 1912. This is a steampunk Cairo, and our main character is a investigator for basically like the paranormal unit, because about 50 years ago in this world, a magician essentially opened up a portal to like the Jinn world. So a bunch of like just magical creatures and things came through and now like exist in our world. So there's Jinn, there's different like magical creatures, there's angels, but they're like not angels. We don't really know what they are. And it's just a very interesting world, magic system, everything. There are triggers in here for self-harm, fire injury, racism, and just themes of colonization. But I dug this so much. I'll be doing a full review on it later on in the month. The world is amazing, lush, interesting. I love these like steampunky type worlds in general anyway, but then we have this like Egyptian influence and the Jinn and everything else. So cool. I could picture everything like so vividly. I really love our main character and a bunch of the side characters as well. There's a ton of like interesting people. Our main character dresses in like really flashy suits. And there's also a sapphic romance going on. There's discussions of like old gods. There's also discussions of Islam that are like wrapped in. So we have this like old and new religious thing happening. Secret societies. Again, the Jinn and the angels. So much. And it's just like this very fast paced, while still having very interesting characters, this like mystery, and the writing is really good. And again, the world, like, I could just be in forever, and the mystery had like a lot of fun twists and turns. It also has a certain level of self-awareness and like funniness to it without being like a comedy book. But I thought the humor in this was really good, and I loved this. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. It has been my favorite of the novels so far. I have 2 more to read for the Hugos. We'll see if anything knocks us out of the top spot for me. And lastly, I read The First Sister by Lyndon A. Lewis. This was our House Salt Book Club pick for this month, so we have already done a full live show talking about it, so I'll link that on the screen. I will also, I think, do a spoiler-free review for this as well. This takes place in a future where Earth and Mars have like teamed up as a sort of society, and Mercury and Venus have as well, but Mercury and Venus are more technologically advanced because Earth and Mars used to fight, and so they're like a little bit behind. And our main character is the first sister on this ship, and sisters are part of the religion where people basically go and confess to them like soldiers and things, but also they are essentially sex workers, but they're forced to be sex workers, so it's very like Handmaid's Tale-esque. So we're following her in her predicament where she doesn't have a lot of agency and she's sort of trapped in this situation. And then we're following another character who's part of that like Mercury-Venus contingent, whose former partner is potentially a traitor. They were soldiers that were like basically psychically linked, and he has been ordered to go and kill that person. So that's the gist of it. There's more there, but like getting into it is so complicated where it's not that complicated when you actually read it. So if it all sounds intriguing, this like space opera that is essentially a combination of The Handmaid's Tale, Red Rising, and the Expanse series meshed together. A lot of elements of all of those are in this. Very fast paced. I read this in 3 days. As mentioned, there are some heavy themes. So trigger warning in here for child abuse, bullying, rape, which is like off page and like discussed, but not on page or graphic, and some suicidal thoughts. This, I didn't really know what to expect going into it. I had heard some good things about it, but I really had no expectations. I hadn't read the blurb in a while before starting it. And this was like I said, very fast paced, just easily readable. The world is interesting, although I wish we would have gotten a bit more of it. Some of the pieces of it didn't quite make sense to me. I did really like all of our characters and the different POVs, and I was very stressed for all of them and like felt for all of them. There's a lot of potential in a lot of the character interactions and like how things are unfolding, and it's basically all these POVs like converging, and I really like multiple POV stories where you know they're gonna kind of all come together. And there were elements that initially I was like, oh, this is bad writing, like this is a gap, and then it ended up being like a bit of a twist. So I thought that was really well done, because there were a lot of things I like didn't see coming, and just like worked really well for this, and I'm very much intrigued about the rest of the series. I do plan on continuing. Again, there were a few little things that held it back about the world building and like some of the character relationships, but ultimately really into it and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, I had a pretty decent reading month. So comment below, let me know how your reading month went. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you plan to now that I've talked about them. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.